the real bit of cartography is to be able to look at that situation and say, we should move these slightly apart so that you can see the road runs beside the river, even if they're not 100% geographically accurate.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. Today I'm talking to a guy called Andy Allen. Now Andy is the founder of a company called Thunder Forest. He's been working on the OpenStreetMap project for the last 10 years. He's a cartographer and he's got some really interesting views. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me today. I really enjoyed our pre-interview chat that we had a few weeks ago, so I'm really looking forward to this. But before we dive into the actual interview, can you just take a few minutes to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Allen. I'm the owner and founder of a small business called Thunder Forest, which makes customized maps and activity-specific maps. And I'm also a long-time OpenStreetMap veteran. I've been involved in the project for more than a decade, and I'm one of the developers for the core piece of software that runs the website and the API.
Now, I think, Andy, you're a really interesting mix because you're a programmer and a cartographer. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think that you'll have quite different perspectives on things. But maybe you could say a little bit about your involvement in OpenStreetMap and how it relates to Thunder Forest.
Sure. So I first got involved in OpenStreetMap back in 2007, 2008 era, just as a volunteer. So we were out mapping the streets of London with a GPS in one hand and going back and adding data to OpenStreetMap. But some of the data that we were adding was for cycling, like where bike routes were, where bike parking was. And this didn't show up so well on the main map. And that's when I first started getting involved in the cartography, making a custom map, now known as OpenCycleMap, which shows lots of things useful for cyclists. Now that kind of grew as a hobby and spiraled out of control a little bit, so it became a full-time job. And as more app developers, more websites wanted to use these maps, and as I came up with more different map styles, like for public transport and for outdoor activities and hiking and things like that, it's become a full-time business.
And so all this data that you use for your maps in Thunder Forest, this comes from OpenStreetMap, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So OpenStreetMap is more than just the map that you see on the front page. So there's all kinds of really interesting details that the OpenStreetMap volunteers add into the database. And you can't show all the details on just one map. So there's all kinds of different people. My company is just one of them who can take that open source data and show it in a new and interesting way, just showing things that are of interest to particular groups of people.
So you're making what I guess you could describe as activity-specific maps.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the maps you see, especially online maps, they're all fairly generic. They're all mostly aimed at car drivers with maybe just a few footpaths thrown in. But I like to make the maps like really focused on what you would need if you're out hiking or what you would need if you're out cycling.
So OpenStreetMap, I guess the listeners of this podcast will be familiar with the OpenStreetMap project. I mean, it's an icon in terms of the geospatial world anyway, in terms of the mapping world. You know, we know that it gets thousands of edits a day. How do you cope with that? How do you ingest those edits in your products and how do you update them?
So we take a feed from OpenStreetMap. The foundation publishes every 60 seconds a little snapshot of all the data that's been added to OpenStreetMap in the last 60 seconds. And so we take all these little diff updates, bundle them up, and apply them to our systems. That then kicks off a process of refreshing our maps, and our customers get to see the updates a few hours later.
For those of us that are into GIS and maybe run a web map of our own for an organization or an interest group or whatever, we're quite used to the idea of caching. So do you have a cache in the background where you have pre-rendered images of your maps that you deliver out to the client? Or how does that work? And what would that mean in terms of updating a global map?
Yeah, so we have two layers of caching. The second layer of caching is the most simple one. We cache the map images that we send out to our customers, and they generally stay in the cache for a few hours. But before that, we don't take things directly from our databases. We create vector tiles, which I'm sure you've heard of. We create vector tiles from the database, and that's a sort of pre-processed snapshot of the map data. Now that's what we keep on disk, and from these vector tiles we can essentially color them in to make all of our different maps. And the coloring in process is lightning quick. It's only a few milliseconds to take this vector data, create the map image from it, and then send it out to the customer.
Okay, so because you have this this sort of light workload, I guess you could call it. So that means that updates from OpenStreetMap, they're not a huge effort for you as such. It's not like it takes weeks to sort of come through into your system before they're visible in Thunder Forest Maps.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all really high performance processing. But we can take these updates, update our vector tiles. Only the ones that have changed need to be updated. So like in a given few hours, sure, there's thousands of changes in OpenStreetMap, but the world's a big place, so we don't need to refresh everything from scratch every time.
In the pre-interview, I just want to stay with OpenStreetMap here for a minute and this idea of editing data and how that works. Because in the pre-interview, we talked a little bit about the amount of edits that are performed on OpenStreetMap data every day. And you mentioned that these edits are performed by both machines and humans. I think we all have a bit of an understanding of what humans look like when they're editing a map, and they can sit in front of the computer and draw and update and that sort of thing. But what kind of tasks are these bots doing, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, so there's a few different companies involved in adding data to OpenStreetMap. And the data comes from a variety of places. One of the obvious ones is in certain jurisdictions, there's the data is available in the public domain. So a lot of people in the US will be familiar with the idea that the local governments provide their map data. So some of this can be useful for OpenStreetMap. Some of it is kind of hard for volunteers to go out and map individually, or just tedious, like drawing the outline of tens of thousands of buildings. So people run scripts and bots that take this data, process it, figure out what's in OpenStreetMap already, what's not in OpenStreetMap, and then while consulting with all the local mappers, the volunteers who are working in a particular region, they figure out what data they want to take from external sources. But there's also companies doing cool, interesting things involving aerial imagery analysis for other places where perhaps there's not so many OpenStreetMap volunteers, but you can figure some stuff out from the aerial imagery. So they use machine learning, get some data, and then often, well, it comes down to a choice. You can either import that into OpenStreetMap or also just make it available for OpenStreetMap volunteers to work with in their editors so they can pick through certain features or maybe adjust them before they get saved into the database. But in both cases, it's key that the volunteers are involved as well, because OpenStreetMap's not just like a dumping ground for gigabytes of data.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I definitely hadn't thought of that before. The idea that the machines could do the bulk of the work first and then present it to the volunteers and say, okay, we've filtered this data. We have a rough idea that this is a house or this is a tree or this is a park or whatever. Can you please look at it and confirm it and add it to the map?
Yeah, it works especially well for areas that are partly mapped already. To provide the extra data to a mapper who can figure out the conflation, figure out which bits overlap or duplicate or are just slightly misaligned, instead of having two petrol stations that are only 5 meters away from each other. It can help a human to go, oh no, there are two petrol stations, one on each side of the road, or no, actually they should both be on the same side of the road. It's just some kind of registration error that's duplicated it.
And I think that really sort of shows a lot of respect to the rest of the community. You know, instead of just having machines do the whole thing, I think, you know, because this is a community project. This has been built by people, volunteers spending thousands of hours of their time to make this sort of global good for us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always worth remembering how many volunteers there are involved in OpenStreetMap. So we're looking at more than 35,000 different people edited OpenStreetMap in the last month. So there's a huge number of people involved, and so there's many willing hands available if you want to update a particular area or a particular set of data.
I don't know the answer to this at all, but is it possible to highlight an area on OpenStreetMap and say, hey, we're missing data here, could you focus here if you're looking for something to do?
There's a few different projects available that can help focus the community either on a specific topic or a specific area, so people can set up these tasks or these challenges and say, hey, either we've got some data for this area, can we work on it, or we've looked at all the bridges that cross railway lines, and sometimes there's roads crossing railway lines and it's neither marked as bridges or underpasses. Can we focus on that? So there's definitely ways of attracting attention to particular topics or places in OpenStreetMap.
I'm really pleased that you took the time to tell us a little bit more about OpenStreetMap, because it is a really exciting project, but it's also quite difficult to find a person to talk to about it because it's a community-run effort. So I really appreciate that. But I'd sort of like to move on now and talk more about cartography in general. Now, your work with Thunder Forest, there's very few people that actually get the opportunity to make almost like a one-size-fits-all map of the world at multiple different zoom levels. Now, I realize, of course, that you're making these sort of activity-specific maps, but in the grand scheme of things, it's like a cycle map for the whole world. You're not making multiple cycle maps for different places in the world. You're making one that fits the whole world at these different zoom levels. What kind of challenges do you face when you're making a map like that?
Well, one of the challenges is trying to convince people that I haven't cycled around the entire world making the map for myself. So I often get emails from people saying, hey, this route in Arkansas should go down this street, and it goes down that street. So there's a bit of explaining as to what OpenStreetMap is, but I like the idea that people think I make these maps, totally from scratch. But the other challenge is just in the cartography. The world is a widely varied place, and it's hard to make a map that looks good in all these different situations and all these different zoom levels. So whether you're riding through backcountry US somewhere, or in the dense urban environments like Hong Kong or Singapore, it all shows up on the map and it all needs to be dealt with. So there's a lot of careful choices go on as to how wide to make streets or what features to show in each zoom level, in order that urban places look busy but not unintelligible or illegible, whilst making sure that enough features show up in rural areas that you don't just get a completely blank map when you look at it. So that's really that kind of global variation in just the density of life. That's one of the key challenges in making these maps, because the process is fully automated. I'm not going in and tweaking certain areas. I need to pick rules and then apply them to the whole world at the same time.
Have you had any sort of pushback around your choice of colors? Because people, they have some, I guess, really strong opinions about what things should look like. And it's one thing to represent a house as a polygon, but there's a whole other thing, your choice of color when you represent a house. Have you run into any sort of cultural differences around those kind of understandings?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are very familiar with the maps from their national geospatial agencies. So in some parts, people expect houses just to be black squares. And if it's not a black square, they don't recognize it as a house. And so I think this was a bigger problem a few years ago when there were fewer different maps on the scene. Basically, people had seen Google Maps and their local mapping agency when I started out. But I think now people are more comfortable with the idea that maps are going to look different. There's so many different suppliers. People see so many different maps on their phones compared to like 10 years ago.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that there's more people doing it now than what there was doing it. But in the grand scheme of things, I still really feel like there's only a couple of really big players, and they've sort of stamped their mark on the cryptography world. If you think about Google, for example, and they came out with they used the Mercator projection. Now they've moved over to the Globe. But at the start, it was the Mercator projection, and I think that kind of set the scene for like this is what the default map of the world looks like. So I could imagine if you come along and you challenge that and say, well, actually, it could look like this or it could look like that. I could imagine you could run into any problems, or some problems, I should say.
Yeah, there's definitely things around familiarity for people, especially with these online maps. A lot of them all kind of converge on the same white background. Well, blue sea seems a bit more reasonable, but the same limited color palette, and I guess it's a bit like websites. It kind of goes in trends. If you think of the variety of websites that there used to be, but like background colors and font colors and things, but everything just coalesces to whatever the aesthetic of the day is. And in online maps, I think the aesthetic is quite minimal at the moment. Now, that's not to say that like a riot of colors is the best approach. I've certainly been guilty of that in the past when I've first introduced elevation-based coloring to OpenCycleMap. It was really strong. The colors were really vibrant. And that's, again, one of these difficulties of doing your own cartography is whatever you're working on right now. So in that case, that year, it was doing this elevation coloring. That's all you're focused on. You get really wrapped up into it. You make something that looks really great. And it's only a couple of weeks later you look back at it and you think, yeah, there are other things on the map as well. It doesn't just need to be full-on elevation coloring. So I've definitely toned that down over the years. But there's a whole lot of experimentation that can be done. Maybe for the big players, it's too much of a risk. They just want to play it safe with the same kind of white, bland color schemes. But I think there's a huge option. And when you look at more traditional cartography, people produce a much wider variety of color palettes and color schemes and ways of visualizing things.
Yeah, I agree. But I think one of the really things that's interesting about your work is you're one cartographer serving thousands and thousands of people. And I think that's the kind of the opposite to that idea of traditional cartography, where you're one cartographer, but you might only be making, 2, 3, 4, a couple of hundred maps maybe, and that they're static. So in a world where one cartographer can serve thousands of people, but we already have a standard, we already have a default in terms of mapping, in terms of those really big players, the Google, the Bing, the Apple Maps, is there still opportunity for cartographers out there today? Or when you look out in the future, what do you think the biggest opportunity is?
I think there's definitely roles for cartographers. I do think the bigger opportunities are around these global map systems. So that traditional cartography might have been about all the way back to taking copper sheets and punching holes in them or marking the ridges so that you can run off a few copies with contact printing. And I think those tools have changed. And I think the opportunities for cartographers to be making like just single-use maps, maybe like a map for a signboard, these are becoming harder and harder to make a living from. So I think there's definitely opportunities in these global maps. At the moment, all these global maps and to a certain extent the maps I make as well, they're really quite simplistic. They're mainly driven by programmers, computer science, and user interface designers without that much reference to cartography. And some of that is a lack of knowledge, and some of it is that the tools are just not capable of producing really high quality cartographic output. So if there's cartographers out there who are interested, there's a huge amount of opportunity in getting involved in this side of the industry and really creating global digital maps in a way that haven't been seen before.
Just when you're talking there and you're talking about opportunity, and I couldn't help but think towards to think about websites, for example, and how they've changed. And they've gone from being these static things, almost pre-rendered, that, one size fits all. We arrive at the website, we see the thing. But now when people talk about websites, they're starting to think that they're starting to think more in terms of segmentation, like who is this person? So we know a little bit about them when they arrive at the website, and we want to lead them on a journey. We want to show them something they're interested in or answer the question for them. Could you imagine maps going in this direction? So instead of having the one sort of global default Google map, for example, could you imagine arriving at a Google map, for example, and it's saying, oh, well, I know a little bit about you. You're so-and-so, you live there, you do this, in the same way they do with normal search, and showing you the things that are more relevant to you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And so one example would be if you're putting on a map for your business. It's a really common use case for maps on websites, is saying, here we are. And a lot of the businesses only kind of just put a marker in the middle of the map, focus the map on where they are, and that's the end of it. But when you think of what people do with sketch maps, they have maps showing the main routes, the main ways that people would get to that location, which way they would approach to get to the car park, and so on. So even if it's not a motorway, if the motorway is just bypassing town, it's not involved in your business, why is that the biggest feature on the map? So you could definitely start seeing maps adjusting more to when they know what's going on. So a digital map could adjust to highlight the roads that are most likely to be used to get to this location, rather than just an off-the-shelf, this is what the map of the local area looks like.
When I hear you talk about it, it makes me excited about cartography. It makes me see that there is actually a future there. And I think too, and the idea of that one cartographer serving thousands and thousands of people and getting the opportunity to make specific maps for specific groups and people instead of that one size fits all, I think that would be really exciting.
I think though, the tools that are needed there are what's going to be interesting, because to be able to do that on scale requires certain software. And again, to take more different types of cartography input into these digital maps requires much better tools than we have. So one example I like to think of is a road and a river running through the countryside, really close to each other, and there's nothing else anywhere near. Now, on most maps, whether it's Google Maps or whoever, you'll either draw the road half on top of the river or the other way around. But the real bit of cartography is to be able to look at that situation and say, we should move these slightly apart so that you can see the road runs beside the river, even if they're not 100% geographically accurate. And so building the tools and bringing in these ideas of how to do better cartography, but to do that cartography at scale, that's where the most interesting challenges lie.
Okay, so you definitely see opportunity in the space for new cartographers, and you see the opportunity being in these global maps. We've talked a little bit about the tools that are needed. Should they have like a GIS background, a geography background? Could they be a designer? Could they be a programmer? Is there any one mix of these skills that you think would be optimal for someone looking to get into the space?
That's not really one that I can comment on too much, because my background is in IT support and my qualifications are all for chemistry. So I'm not a programmer, I'm not a cartographer, I'm not a GIS analyst. So I think this shows that it's more about what you learn, if you're willing to learn stuff, and also if you're willing to push the boundaries and do something new. If you have a good idea and you're willing to run with it. Now, there's definitely stuff around knowing a bit of programming, bit of GIS, but you can pick up a lot of these things whenever you figure out what the problem is and run with it. But I think a key thing with any of this is, if it's involving business, you got to be focused on your customers, and it's what your customers need. And if you don't have any customers yet, then think about what it is you need. If you are unhappy with maps, if you're unhappy with the map you're using, that's a great place to start. That was where I got involved in the first place. It wasn't that the map was bad, it just didn't fit my needs. And so that drove me to learn the tools, learn some cartography, and take it from there.
We've come a long way now. We started off talking about Thunder Forest and how that relates to your work or your previous work at OpenStreetMap, and we've moved sort of through into cartography in a very general way, but answering some big questions along the way, I think. So just before we say goodbye, I've got a couple more questions for you. And one of them, I feel like we've touched on this a little bit, but what is cartography going to look like in the future?
I hope lots more cartography. That's what it is. I hope it doesn't just become a lowest common denominator, something run by computer science majors who are focused on efficiency and rendering times and things like that. Because I remember looking at things like National Geographic maps when I was a kid, or Ordnance Survey maps in the UK, and all the details and all that kind of like really careful thought that was put into making these maps, making them not because it was the quickest way to make them or involved the least ink or the fewest colors or anything like that, but to really get the best representation of the world. So I think that's where I hope it heads. I think that's my future. That's what I hope, at least.
Is there one company out there that's doing this really well today, apart from Thunder Forest, of course?
Yeah.
But is there any sort of industry leaders you look to and go, wow, these guys, they're doing something amazing. They're doing something interesting. They're thought leaders.
There's a few of them who are definitely pushing the boundaries. There's different boundaries that get pushed though. So Stamen, a big name from San Francisco, they're always doing really interesting things with cartography. And Mapzen, who unfortunately kind of had a rocky period over the last couple of years, they were really pushing some of the technology. Unfortunately for me, some of their maps ended up being more technology demos than maps themselves. But it was great to have people focused on pushing the boundaries of what the technology can do beyond just drawing some lines and filling in some polygons.
Andy, I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed this sort of look into the world of cartography and where it's going and the industry itself. So thanks again for that. Really great. Just before we say goodbye, where can we go to follow along with your work and maybe learn more about you?
Well, you can see all the stuff I do for work is at thunderforest.com. And then if you want more insights into what I'm up to, have a look at Gravity Storm on Twitter.
We will do. Thanks again, Andy.
You're very welcome. Great to talk to you.
And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel, and today I'd like to ask you for a small favor. If you're enjoying this podcast and have a friend that might enjoy it, I would really appreciate it if you would share it with them. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, you are more than welcome to reach out to me on social media if you have any questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. Cheers. Bye.